Welcome to a live with Dr. Marika Sardar. Marika, as you know, is a very celebrated art historian and a curator, and we're thrilled to have her here. Thank you very much, Marika, for taking us on our first of a series where we chase museums and their treasures. So, Marika took us around the special collection at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. We hope you've seen the film. And if you haven't, Nehal is going to leave us a link in the chat box soon. Everyone here knows the drill. Marika and I'll be in conversation. If you have questions, please leave them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we'll keep an eye on them. And we can ask our questions to Marika. Thank you, Marika, for making the time. It's a pleasure to have you on LHI Circle.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a very nice chance to look at some of the paintings we've been separated from at the museum all these last months that are, in a building just a few miles away from us.
There you go. And we get to travel with you to these collections, and that has been fantastic. I'm sure it wasn't easy to pick 10 out of a large collection, but you're used to picking fabulous paintings and other objects out of fabulous collections. Marika Sardar has been at the San Diego Museum. She's been at the Met. She was at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. And now the Aga Khan Foundation, Aga Khan Museum has managed to get her to Toronto. This is enviable, Marika. Before I knew you, and when I was following your work for all these years, I just always thought, my God, she's managed to look at so much work and brought this out. So if I have to ask you, and it's a difficult question, I know, but if we need to ask you, if there were objects from the Met, from San Diego, from MIA that have particularly struck you, and that you're carrying them with you, as it were, what would these be?
Well, you're right. I have been very lucky, and it's a real privilege that not only do I get to work with these collections, but we're handling them, and don't tell anyone we touch them, and then to also then share them with the public. And over the years, today's talk was focusing mostly on paintings, but there were things in other media that I really enjoyed from these collections. So from the Met, for instance, because they have such a broad collection, it was really the textiles there that I enjoyed looking at. So it was a kalamkari piece in particular that was my first introduction to looking into textiles like this, and it's an extraordinary thing. It's taller than I am, so when you think of the scale of this and that it was attached to so many other panels like this, just the production of such an object was overwhelming. And then learning about the dyeing process and so on. Aside from all these charming vignettes on it, I mean, it's just such a kind of attractive piece, I would say. And, looking to other media only helps inform your study of paintings, right? So you always need to ground that in a fuller understanding of the arts of the period. So in that vein, at San Diego, best known for its collection of paintings too, but I really got interested in this one sculpture. We had Gandharan sculpture. And just now this one is smaller than you might expect, unlike the textile. But just the way the different surfaces were treated, and there are different levels of Gandhara sculpture. If you start looking at them closely, some are real clunkers, but this one was just so sinuous and smooth and sensual and so attractive. And in the end, we actually decided at San Diego to remove it from the wall and display it in the center of the gallery, where you could walk around and even, think a bit about, its context and how it had arrived there and been removed from some kind of building.
The details of this are fantastic. I have slippers like that now.
And how about the jewelry?
Oh, No jewelry for me.
Okay.
Gandharan especially. But this,
Right.
so did when you said you moved it, it was stuck against a wall, was it?
Yes, and that's how you would have experienced it originally. So the way curators had always shown it was against the gallery walls, and we decided to try out moving it to the center, so you would have the ability to walk all around it. There are details on three sides, really.
Yes.
And it changed your experience of the piece. It brought a bit more attention to it, I think. Not being against
Absolutely.
the wall.
Yes. It's the robes that completely fascinate me on this sort of period where every detail comes through, and there are so many stories that the stone holds within itself. Absolutely fascinating. We can have you talk about this sculpture for a long time, I'm sure.
Yes, no, all of these we could go on for days.
Yes.
Then in Doha, manuscript I just got absolutely entranced by was a copy of the Ramayana in Persian language that we believe was written for Akbar's mother, Hamida Banu, and there's lots of evidence to show that. And it's to have this entire complete manuscript, just because of the history of way of paintings have been collected and manuscripts treated. You often just have parts or single pages in collections. So this was nearly intact. And so you had it's beautiful to be able to experience the story being told as you read through, and then you come across these magical paintings every few pages or so. And to think of the interesting circumstances of how it was made, and then this, I think, very interesting approach to actually illustrating the Ramayana. And this was one of my favorite paintings. So during the battle with Ravana, at one point, these sort of holograms of the bodies of Rama and Lakshmana are brought to Sita so that she believes that they have died.
Yeah.
They haven't yet at this point in the battle, but just that pose where she's holding her head in her hand, and just that grief comes right off the page.
Absolutely. This might be a good time to tell our viewers there's a book, isn't there, about. So do you want to very quickly tell us about the book?
Sure. With the art historian John Seiler and with historian Audrey Trushke, we published this manuscript, actually. So it includes all the paintings in full-size reproduction, but also situating it in when it was made at the Mughal court, Hamida Banu and her library that we know about, and then trying to think about the artists who made this. And John Seiler had actually identified 3 figures that we are pretty sure were responsible for.
So I'm assuming that there are inscriptions on this, because Hamida Banu's collection and the fact that she was also patronizing and was one of the first patrons of this kind of opulent manuscript is quite stunning.
Yes, so the front page of the manuscript has all kinds of inscriptions, and the earliest of those says that the manuscript was transferred from the estate of Hamida Banu right after her death to the main imperial treasury. So this was in 1604. So working back from that, we were able to trace it to her patronage, really. And yes, there are a set of other manuscripts she had a stamp that he used to mark her books. And so from this, we have a really interesting picture of what she was up to and the kind of manuscript she was looking at.
Visually as well, it's stunning. The mountains, the figures. I love the monsters. I've always thought that the monsters we've been talking about monsters. I did a short film on Devi, which you should all see if you have the time. It's on LHI Circle. Plugs are necessary. And I was fascinated by the depiction of monsters, even as a Devi is, or whichever goddess they're depicting is just fabulous, equally beautiful and somehow so tender are the monsters themselves.
Yes, I think, here we have the various demonic figures and data who are, meant to keep Sita captive always in Radha's palace. But, they're also responding to these supposed deaths and to Sita's grief. And you can see that just in their expressions, despite the fact that the artist had some fun giving them some really grotesque features. There is some emotion there as well.
A lot. Marika, most people, when they think of Islamic art of the subcontinent, they think of Mughal art. But while that is such a big part of it, you've spent years traveling around the Deccan, and that is where I believe your heart lies. Is that an overstatement?
No, I think that would be accurate.
So, what is it about the Deccan that drew you in?
Well, it was two parts, I'd say. The works of art themselves, as you know, they're quite different from things being produced in other parts of India and at different moments in time. So it's always a personal connection, right? In what you end up studying, don't you think? And just also the historical circumstances of that place in the 16th, 17th century, I found so interesting. And, there was a lot of work to be done in the Deccan. The Mughal world is so well trod at this point that it was an opportunity to step into something new, bring works of art maybe to a wider public attention. And the response of things like the exhibition we planned at the Met, shows that also the public finds these works of art to be incredibly attractive and intriguing as well.
So I have to say that when the show that she says they planned was actually a blockbuster show that completely shook the art world and forever changed, I think, research trajectories of many an art historian. This is, of course, the Sultans of the Deccan that you had with Navina Haider at the Met. And it was just a gorgeous show. And it comes with a very beautifully produced catalog. So how was it putting together this show? And it's not the first time you made a massive show about the Deccan, is it?
Well, the Deccan exhibition, and I should say, I really started as Navina Haider's assistant, and I really appreciate her support and how much, I was able to become a part of the project. And to do your first major exhibition at the Met is really something I feel grateful for, because you have the resources of this amazing institution behind you, and everyone is willing to lend their works of art to the Met. So we were able to put together, treasures really from all kinds of collections that wouldn't normally lend these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So this was several years in the making. Over 150 objects came to New York in 2015. And, because this was maybe one of the first few exhibitions of the Deccan, we felt like we needed to introduce people in a very basic way. So we organized each gallery by a court. So here we can see the Bijapur room was the one in purple. Bidar was given this bright green. And here we had, next to the galleries on the courts, one room on the fabulous diamonds of coming out of the Golconda area. So another note was that the insurance for this exhibition was quite hefty when you think of the size of the gems we had on view. We tried to walk people through not only the history and the interrelations between these courts and who were the major figures, their contacts to Iran, to Europe, to China, and so on. And then, of course, the works of art, or the stars. And we brought out, in the end, a lot of paintings in particular.
Yes. Um, you said something very interesting, Marika, when you were talking about paintings earlier just now, where it's not only works on paper, it's not only something figurative. So, what is your process when you were putting together Sultans of the Deccan? How were you looking at these artworks? How did you make a selection? Because, my God, the Met has a lot.
Yes, yes. So, it's a combination of bringing out the stars that everybody knows, but when you see them in person, it's such a different experience, right? And really trying to define maybe what was unique to each court through these works of art. Then we were looking for new things that maybe people hadn't seen, that were hidden away in different collections, hadn't been identified as Decany or brought into conversation with the
Right.
well-known works of art. And then, yeah, you're trying to tell a story, right? So you need to make that storyline cohesive. So you end up editing things here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the politics of the world intervene in funny ways too. So for many, many years, the US has not been able to get loans from Russian museums, for instance, because of larger political issues at work. From Iran, it's impossible. So, some of the things you might really expect to see in a
Right.
show on the Deccan simply couldn't travel to the US. So I know there was an exhibition at the National Gallery also around this time. They might have been able to pull in other works that, couldn't actually travel to New York at the time.
Right. We've got a question, Marika, on the beautiful kalamkari that you showed us. And can you tell us a little bit more? Who are these people in the kalamkari? Do we know what do we understand of the art itself? So just a little bit more, because that, of course, has intrigued audiences for a while. So, do you want to take us through it a little bit?
Yes, so what you're looking at is one panel of a textile that we knew was much larger. So we have a panel of about this size and scale at the Victoria and Albert Museum, for instance, and then little pieces of it that might be in other collections too. So imagine, I don't know, 7, 8 of these all sewn together and perhaps forming like a tent enclosure is what we imagine for the original context of these. So we have so many Mughal or Rajput style tents. Here is a Deccan version that's just teeming with people and pattern and design, right? So imagine if you're in this enclosure and you have all these figures around you, what that experience is. So as far as what the imagery represents, this is also a huge mix of things, and we're trying to understand this still. So on the bottom left here, I think this might be reversed, you see a figure riding a horse, right? So we can actually identify the European, thank you for pointing that out, the European engraving that this references. So we understand European prints are traveling to India at this time, but how is it that this kalamkari artist, who we understand is not right at the court, but in some coastal region where the dyes and the water and everything you need are available to make this kind of textile, how are they getting access to this? What was the process of interpretation from that original 1500s print to it appearing here? Then this figures in the middle. The gentleman has sort of a Iranian style of turban and jama, and then the woman also has a very distinctive type of dress. We're trying to figure out if these are perhaps Armenian figures. And then others are dressed more typically like you'd expect at Golconda of Egypt, or they look like the courtiers in the paintings. And then they're sort of set in this structure that seems to be like a palace with many pavilions in it. So I've worked on this a lot, but I feel like there's a lot of mystery still surrounding it. Why
Yeah.
are all these figures together in this arrangement? Is
And the
this
women,
generally the world of the court, or is there some deeper iconography here that we're not grasping? I don't know.
perhaps it's for a pleasure pavilion because women, as someone has pointed out, aren't veiled. You can see them. We've, of course, do you think that this was for a personal sort of setting up, for a personal setup? Do you think it was, or were women just not veiled in the decking?
No, I think when you see them in the paintings, right? Sorry, you cut out for a second. You were asking why the women are not.
Women who aren't veiled at all in this one. Do you think that was? Do you think it reflects contemporary styles of dressing?
Absolutely. So there, women don't often appear in the paintings, but they are there, and this is, absolutely comparable to paintings you might see. So if you think of the Pame name, which is all about women's, a manuscript from Bijapur, 1590s, and you look at the dress of the women in that, you would see that similarity and know they are not veiled.
There, and is that a family portrait in the middle? I wonder, which.
So then, I started looking at examples, since we already know in this piece that there is reference to European engraving. Is this like sort of a Mary, Jesus, and just some kind, is it deriving from that? But, then you start looking at the paintings, prints of the period from Europe, it wasn't really matching that. So yes, maybe just a very touching portrait of the parents and their newborn baby.
That's very sweet. Lauren Michael asks, what is the medium of the artwork? What kind of pigments? And when we think of kalamkari, can you just very quickly tell us how this was possibly made?
Okay, so this is large pieces of cotton cloth sewn together and then dyed. So each of the colors that you see here has been applied either by first putting on what's called a mordant that helps that particular color of dye, which this would be like the purples and the reds, for instance, really sort of attach themselves to the cotton. Then you have some dyes that, you would cover the whole surface in, say, a wax that you don't want that dye to adhere to, and then you put it in a bath. So this would be for the case of the blues, for the indigo. So, sorry, let me step back a moment. You have, they're called kalamkaris. Kalam refers to a pen that you are drawing these mordants and resists with, and then drawing the dyes onto. So the dyes are made from different plants, and each one is applied in a separate process. So you get that onto the cloth, you wash it, you dry it in the sun, and then do the next color. So you can imagine this is a very laborious, time-consuming, and really skilled production.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. And there's so much of this in the decking. We've got, I'll move you to the next one that we went to the San Diego image, because someone's asking us, Taradhar is asking us, is the Gandharan Bodhisattva a unique piece in the San Diego Museum, or is it a part of the collection? When did the museum acquire it? Do you have provenance for it? And do we know which Bodhisattva it could be?
Okay. So it's interesting looking at how things over the years, and for whatever reason, Gandhara sculpture was very popular. I think it's the story of these cultural, streams meeting there that was very attractive to people in sort of the 1950s, 60s, and so there are a lot of US museums that have Gandharan sculpture in particular out of all the different, periods of time. So this particular piece, I don't think we know its history prior to 1970s, 80s. It was a purchase at the museum, and it joins a few other Gandharan sculptures that we happen to have there. And so I would say this is a pretty typical provenance, and now museums are trying to do more research to establish these chains of movement. And as far as
chains of movements are very murky, aren't they?
Yes, and I don't think we'll ever know how exactly each piece arrived, where it has ended up now, but that is something that museums are focusing on more in general, and there is a desire to be more transparent. So if you look at websites like the Met, for instance, or even the San Diego one, they will now tell you how they acquire, to the best of their knowledge. So anyway, sorry, that was a
no, but it's an important conversation, I think, because a lot of collections are acquired in moments of conflict, and even if we let the last century go, we can't. But even if we do, current conflicts and collecting, historians, art historians, curators at museums are being very conscious of the way art markets will flood. I'm thinking of Afghanistan. Everyone was quite worried. And I think that how museums acquire objects, and then if we can piece together the history. I mean, at some point, imagine if all these kalamkari rugs you reunite in a certain sense. How lovely would that be? Mark, I'm going to drag you on and drag you towards the Deccan, as it were. A very silly question, perhaps, but can you, if we have to ask you what the Deccan is as a region, where is the Deccan in the Indian subcontinent?
Okay, so that one was easy. It's sort of this central area. It's distinct from the southernmost parts of the subcontinent, and the northern, because of a topography that separates it. And, sort of the main cities today would be Hyderabad, Mumbai, so on, right? So, but sort of the reason why it is distinct is really mountains on the coast, rivers on its northern and southern boundaries that sort of allowed for this area even before the sultanates that, the exhibition focused on were established, had been its own separate cultural nexus, and the artistic traditions there, architectural traditions there had been distinct for centuries already. So then what happens when Muslim sultanates are established in the 14th century is then you have even other overlays coming into the region. So you have Arabic, Persian literature coming in, you have Urdu, you have, right? So just in terms of the linguistic mix there, it's quite rich, and all these new layers arrive. Then you have even artistic connections, say, to the larger Islamic world, because these sultans are looking to manuscripts or other works of art from Iran in particular. And then you start to have huge immigration of people from Iran as well. So they bring with them these traditions. You have the start of carpet weaving at this time, for instance, an industry that hadn't existed prior to this moment. Then you have an interest in porcelains from China. So you have also from the East, new types of works of art and artistic traditions flowing in. So it's really an interesting mixture and interest in other cultures at this moment that we're talking about.
As the Deccan grows, it's not a uniform culture throughout. And I'd like you to, and someone's asked this in our Q&A, saying, can we really distinguish between art forms within the Deccan Sultanate? So the larger Bahmani world, and then when it breaks up into smaller kingdoms, is it possible, or do you see that artistic traditions are similar coast to coast and over centuries?
So, and this is the lines we sort of followed on in that exhibition, that there are distinctive Golconda or Bijapur styles. That's where we have the most paintings surviving from, and Ahmednagar as well. And so if you look at a group of things that are identified as being from those courts, flip through the pages of a book or something, you can maybe see something that separates the three. But people were moving, manuscripts were moving, right? The courts were constantly in contact, and the daughter of this one, a sultan, might be married to the son of that sultan, and when the wedding occurs, gifts are given, including works of art from the treasuries, right? So I don't know that we can, should be in scholarship going forward, so definitive about what is from one court and what's from another, because what we think looks like one, actually that can move.
And frequently, the whole idea of travel and transcultural encounters is what sets the Deccan apart from other paintings and time periods. Can we make a comparison between Deccan and perhaps Mughal paintings? Are there stylistic differences? Are there thematic differences? What have you seen when you've been doing your research?
Yeah, so I think, Mark Zabrowski was the art historian who wrote this, first major book about Deccani painting. Well, all right, Stella Kramrisch was there before, but what we refer to now, and that has all of the beautiful illustrations in colors, this 1980s publication, and he writes about Deccani art as being otherworldly, dreamlike, and really setting it in opposition to what he characterized the Mughal as more, being a record and trying to be realistic in its own way, and harder lines and portraits and official events that are recorded in paintings, whereas in the Deccan you have other types of figures, yogis, yoginis, you have even the portraits of the rulers are in these fantastic pinks and greens and purples, sort of colors that you don't see in the Deccan, in the north, in the Mughal court. And they are lounging in much more casual positions than you might see, a Mughal portrait. But I think that was helpful to start defining the Deccan and to give it sort of a brand so that we could move on with our work and research. And so sort of, I think maybe talking about it as being in this dream world, we don't want to then discount the achievements of Deccani painting as well. So I think it might function in a different way. And we do have types of manuscripts.
Is that because they had a deeper connection to Central Asia and North Africa, an independent one? Or do you think that it was just the nature of the way art was being expressed and patronage?
Yeah, I think so. And the artists themselves, right? I think even though we know that patrons had an important role in sort of driving the production of manuscripts or paintings in a specific way, they're not there telling the artist how something should look. That's in the end the hand of that individual and who they're sitting with at the time and their conversations and so on. So that's how I'm imagining this development was on the ground there.
Right. And what was your, when you started to explore the Deccan, you weren't looking at paintings, were you, Marika? You were exploring architectural spaces. Where all, and were you only looking at Golconda? What was your on ground research like? If I'm going to pull you
Right.
away from painting for a few minutes.
Yeah. So I actually started working on Golconda Fort, and so spent a lot of time in Hyderabad and tramping around the fort. But of course, it doesn't exist in a vacuum there. So really being able to understand it involved traveling all over the Deccan to starting with the Bahmani forts, Bidar, Gulbarga, Firozabad, and so on, and trying to understand sort of the earliest phases of Golconda, even Kakatiya period forts, and trying to separate out what fortifications look like in the 12th, 13th century, then 14th century, going to tiny places like Koilkanda, Kalas, all these, it was fantastic travel. And then when Golconda became a sort of the capital of a sultanate under the Qutb Shahi sultans, then looking to Bijapur, Ahmednagar, and so on became more relevant, right? How did all of these develop? So at the time, though, I had never made it to Berar, the sort of fifth mysterious sultanate of the Deccan that doesn't get mentioned too often, just as a side note, because it gets absorbed so early on into Ahmednagar that we don't have paintings from there. The architecture seems to reflect later periods, but in preparation for the Deccan exhibition, got to travel out. It was just such a magical trip to these forts. These beautiful remote sites, and there's so much there actually, and it just, the region is so rich. No one's had the chance yet to focus on these particular places, but I think that they are just as deserving of study as the others. And so for the Deccan exhibition, we were able to send a photographer out to these sites. So what you're looking at is the work of Antonio Martinelli, who intrepidly went to all kinds of sites. He went to museums to photograph manuscripts and so on behalf of the exhibition. So yes, this is the kind of way you do research, just by walking around these places, photographing, recording, etc.
Marika, if someone is, without the backing of the Met, sets out to look at Deccani art, what are the collections that they would look at? Where would you begin an exploration of the arts of the Deccan, other than, of course, the catalog?
Right. So there are great collections, say at the National Museum, and then it's really scattered, across Europe and the Americas. There's lots of collections with pockets of Deccani art. V&A, of course, has really rich holdings, and the Met would be, of course, the second to that. And I think going and seeing the landscape and the buildings there is another important way to sort of immerse yourself in the Deccan, aside from the objects that have traveled all over. Yeah. And then the Salarjung Museum itself.
Of course, the Salarjung Museum, the Jagdish and Kamla Mittal Museum.
Yes.
Private museums also have a lot, and for very good reasons. We've got a lot of Deccani art even in Rajasthan. Palace Museum seem to have a lot of them. Is there a right way of looking at this kind of work, Marika? If I needed, I know it's a broad question, but how do you approach Deccani art or a painting specifically? Is there a cheat sheet?
Yeah, so I think you start, if you come across something new, you start with your, these sort of stereotypes that we were talking about earlier, what a Bijapur painting looks like, what a Golconda painting looks like. And you, just then move from there, because the paintings we see are never, just pristine records as they, came out of whatever workshop they were being made. There's a long history of for each of these things as they travel through the centuries, and other people, there isn't this fear of intervening, right? So paintings get repainted, they get put into new pages and borders and things added to them. So it's also a process of sort of excavation
Absolutely.
of what it is you're looking at, and maybe there are later phases that you want to sort of understand separately from the original work of art.
And this, I think, will also apply to looking at paintings in general. And this might be a nice time to ask you if there are some favorite picks that you have, not only of the Deccan, of course, but Islamic art in general. Sorry, before we go there, we have a question that links to our older one, where Lauren Michael asks if there are any significant collections of Deccani art in Iran.
Yes, and I might have skipped over that because I myself have not been able to travel, but yes, for sure. So there's a few ways that Deccani art has ended up there. As I was mentioning, during the 16th, 17th centuries, there was actually lots of contact between the two regions on an official level. Embassies were going back and forth. And so works of art would have traveled as gifts, but also ambassadors in the Deccan were buying things and taking them home with them. And vice versa. So there is a Shahnameh manuscript in the Princeton University collection, for instance, that has an inscription in the front. So we know which embassy from Golconda this man was on when he purchased this thing and brought it back to India. So there are historical, much earlier collections of things from the Deccan in Iran. Then we have this moment in the 18th century when Nader Shah attacks Delhi and takes all kinds of things back to Iran with him. And so that would include Deccani material that the Mughals had collected.
Absolutely.
So that's now would be in museums there as well. And so then another layer of this history would be Iran-Russia relations that took a lot of Deccani art then on to Russian collections, things that were given as diplomatic gifts, including this diamond from Ahmednagar, with the inscription of Bahan Nizam Shah in the year 1000. So thinking of how things ended up in different places before this sort of modern art market that we were talking about and how things have been purchased, you really need to dive into geopolitical contexts and histories to understand why things are where they are.
And why things are where they ideally shouldn't even be. Like, how did these people get their hands on stuff? If we travel a little bit back in time, is there a connection with China too? And what sort of evidence do we have in material and visual culture about a connection with China in the Deccan?
Yeah, so I think the period of the sultanates, we really need to explore this much further. There are traces earlier, Chinese pilgrims coming to the Deccan, right, to see the Buddhist sites and so on, and they left records. So we know that the travel routes are well worn by this point, and of course things like Chinese porcelain have been valued in India and imported for centuries at this time. Politically, there doesn't seem to have been the same kinds of connections, but I think on a level underneath where the courts were operating, we want to look at how these places were connected in much more detail.
Right. And speaking of detail, I'm going to ask you to now talk, and because we're also running out of time, in an hour flies past. So we've got you talking about some very interesting paintings, and I'd like you to. Oh, someone has asked you. Taradhar says, could you talk a bit about one of the 10 works of the art that you chose from the Palace Garden? Oh. I hope you've seen the film. Yes, we are going to talk about a couple of paintings that Marika has picked, and I think a good place to start might be Abul Hassan's painting, which is just absolutely stunning, including where the fact that it's inscribed and such a gorgeous work.
Yes, so this is really one of the treasures of our museum here at the Aga Khan, and I think the reason it's appealing is it's so different from these official sort of courtly works of art. It's not a portrait of a ruler surrounded by finery and all of his courtiers and so on, but it's this very simple, humble man. And thinking about Abul Hassan as an artist, and so much of his personality comes through in these kinds of works. He did produce those official records, working very close contact with the emperors. But then something like this, what was his interest in this figure, and putting it in this black background with just this other one flowering plant also in the composition. I think it's just so masterful and shows an absolutely different way of approaching picture making than what he had to do in the official context.
Picture collecting too, because in the film you mentioned that this might have been stuck into a new album and a very nicely chosen album page. What can you tell us about making of albums? Were albums also being made in the Deccan, the way they were being made in the Mughal court?
Yes, so just to explain a little bit, you have manuscripts where you have a text being written out and space left for paintings that then the artists fill in, right? So that's one mode of creating pictures. Then the albums are a different mode where you take works of art that are sort of standalone images that haven't been made in relation to a text, and you put them in a book, but with borders around them, with calligraphy around them. And the albums that we have, or that we can reconstruct, we see a dialogue. So if you imagine opening the page, right, of an album, you have two facing images. The dialogue between them was absolutely that's something whoever's constructing these albums thought about a lot. And then in the Mughal albums, you have on top of that this sort of rhythm of having facing pages of paintings and then facing pages of calligraphy. So as you go through the book, you're also having this different kind of visual experience. And part of constructing the album is putting these borders around the painting. So what Abul Hassan did, if you go back to that image, his work of art is just this rectangular, smaller inset piece with the black background on it. And then everything around that has been added in the process of putting it in an album. And this doesn't look typically like the Imperial Mughal album borders. So I'm imagining that it's in fact moved several times from when he painted it. And that's typical too. You have these albums that are themselves cannibalizing earlier manuscripts or earlier albums, and then they get moved around again, right? So it's this process of collecting and recollecting, and each time you might put different things around the painting there. So in this case, It's sort of this beautiful illumination, but you have first the ruled border, then this floral border, then you have a dyed page with illumination on that, and it's all just beautifully framing your vision of these. It's like, European paintings with these beautiful gilt frames that are as prominent in the viewing of those paintings as the canvas itself.
That's absolutely fascinating. Also, because it tells us about a recontextualizing of artworks, doesn't it? What do you pick? Where do you put it? How do you what's the narrative that you're building? And frequently, it was portraits of other artists that also had. It was portraits and with borders telling a story parallelly, which was
absolutely yes. So the artists, just as important, artists might be assigned to do the borders, and you have beautiful illustrations, beautiful details that come out in those borders. So a lot of work has been done on Mughal albums and exhibitions and books and so on, but everyone was making albums. So you asked about that. So the Rajasthani rulers, the Deccani rulers, it became this popular language then as the Europeans came in, as early as 17th, 18th century, they're making albums as well. And they all have their own sort of language, how you construct the border, what's in the border. You can tell some differences regionally and chronologically as well. So this is a lovely example here of a page from one of the albums made for Shah Jahan. So we have the portrait in the center, but then the details, right, of these other figures who are included in the borders are, they're almost just as important, prominent visually as the central fellow here. And they're doing things like looking at jewels, examining swords, and so on. So they, bring out other aspects of life at the court that you don't always see in the paintings themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marika, for this. We have another very interesting question. They're asking about Islamic gardens. So if there are Mughal gardens in Kashmir and there are specific architectural details, and paintings also frequently show these architectural details. And within the Deccan too, are there paintings that are gardens depicted in the same way, do you think? And what can you tell us about gardens in paintings?
Okay, interesting. So there is, again, the examples that spring to mind are from particular periods. So I can think of, an illustration of the Baburnama, for instance, that shows a garden being constructed for Babur. And then you have so many scenes in Mughal paintings of people having picnics and so on, and you see the garden in them. So we can pick up sort of an understanding of what they look like, what they were planted with, all these kinds of things from the gardens. But until those pictures coming out of Faizabad, I think there was a question about that as well. We talked about one of these in the video. I don't think that the garden is the sort of central focus of paintings, until this very brief moment there where these wonderful panoramas are being created. And yes, there are human figures there, but I think the real subject comes out to being, the palace and all of those wonderful walled gardens.
I think walled gardens and palaces is good. It needs to be another theme for LHS Circle to explore. So thank you, Taradhar, for this. I've made a note for it, and I think that we need to devote more time to exploring just gardens and across the subcontinent. Marika, I wanted to ask you, how is it So if an art historian or a curator, frequently I think of them as detectives, and as people who are chasing very random seeming leads. You've been working on, and you've spoken about this in the film as well, you've worked on a very interesting portrait, or a set of portraits in one. How do you approach something as complicated? And do you also see yourself as a detective who's following different streams?
Absolutely. Yes, that is our main job. And so like I was saying, the approaching a new work of art does start with that first initial, what is it I'm looking at? And is it really all of the same piece? So I think this example was one discussed in the video as well. It's a chart that, it's like a family tree of Jahangir, so the emperor who's seated at the center of this piece, yeah. But it's not just written with names, of course. You've got these beautiful portraits showing who all of these figures are. And sort of the assumption had been that, you know, just directly below Jahangir, there is circle for a portrait, and since the other portraits show his sons and mysteriously Khurram or Shah Jahan is not shown, well, it must have been him. So yeah, you start with this bit of information and then you think, okay, these prominent scholars have written these things before me, of course they're right, but then I think there's so much more to get into here. And once I'm able to see this in person again, you know, for those of you who don't know, here we are still working from home, in fact. I think that, you know, we need to look more closely at that illumination at the top to see at the bottom where I think there are further lines, that this is a much longer scroll type thing, so taking the Mughal family back generations and generations. And then I started to think, you know, does it make sense if Shah Jahan was the favorite successor for him to be below Jahangir in this kind of setting, and where Jahangir is so clearly facing another one of his sons? So that's where this theory I just floated for the first time in the video came up, that maybe it was made precisely in this period where Shah Jahan had rebelled against his father. This document was made specifically not including him, and Jahangir is shown holding this falcon facing his son who is receiving it, to show that, okay, I've switched my choice of successor to this fellow. And then the figures below were always his ancestors, as they are here. So these are, this is a son of Timur from whom the Mughals claimed descent. So I think understanding the language of these paintings and how official portraits are meant to work, you don't, these kinds of things where an emperor is holding a falcon is very particular, right? It's not just any portrait that would have that. Those paintings have a particular purpose to them.
One thing that we didn't talk about, and I'm very interested in, is this the top register of this painting. It is architectural.
Yes, you know, you're right. I had, just in my mind, I immediately leaped to sort of the illumination you find at the top of a text page. So when you first are starting a manuscript, you have this piece of decoration, but this one sort of looks like a central dome with two domes on the side in a way, now that you mentioned it. So is it placing the figures in some kind of architectural setting, but also acting as an illumination. I think that's an intriguing suggestion.
I wonder if it is, if because it looks a bit like a mihrab. It has all the scallops, and it's quite fascinating. And this is how I suppose we come up with But you're right. Now that you say it's an illumination, and there's the cartouche as well, where words could probably be written.
Yeah.
Marika, we've hit the 8 o'clock mark. So I'm going to do a quick rapid fire with you before we let you go. Favorite museum to go check out Islamic art of South Asia?
Oh, gosh. Okay, I'm going to direct you all to the V&A. I think that's an old and maybe not most surprising answer, but really the depth of their collections and the variety of materials they have there, I think really
are quite astounding. Is there a favorite artwork that you'd like us to see when we come to the Aga Khan museum at some point?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think one of the most interesting
That's the famous Qualia Quran that we've spoken about.
Yes, and this one is always on view because it's such an important piece. So yes, very nice to see in person if you can make it.
Fantastic, and we will hopefully at some point. I'm now beginning to wonder if when is that going to be that we'll be able to travel and see museums, and perhaps to perhaps meet in person. So thank you very much, Dr. Marika Sardar, for your time, insights, and for taking us through not only your museum just now, which is the Aga Khan Museum, but also a journey into the Deccan, to San Diego, to the Met, and around the world. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you so much.